A rapper walks into one of the most famous jewelry stores in America, picks out over $200,000 worth of chains, watches, and diamonds, and walks out without paying a single dollar. No alarms, no arguments, no problem. The staff, smiling, taking pictures, treating him like royalty. For months, everything looked perfect. The jewelry was everywhere, on Instagram, in videos, in public. Millions of people saw it. But then, everything flipped. That same store turned around and filed a lawsuit for over $300,000, accusing him of not paying up. Now it looks simple, right? A celebrity runs up a tab and doesn't pay. But here's the part nobody talks about. What if the store wanted him to take the jewelry? What if the real money wasn't in selling chains, but in using his fame? And what if the lawsuit itself was part of the play? Because when Young Thug finally pushed back against Icebox, he didn't just defend himself. He exposed a system that's been quietly profiting off rappers for years. And once you understand how it works, you'll never look at the jewelry game the same way again. To really understand how this situation even happened, you have to step into Atlanta around 2017, a time when the city wasn't just influencing hip-hop, it was hip-hop. And right in the middle of that wave was Young Thug. At that point, he wasn't just another rapper trying to make it. He was already a major name. His sound was different, his style was unpredictable, and his influence was everywhere. Whether people loved him or didn't understand him, one thing was clear. He had attention. A lot of it. And attention, in the world of business, is currency. Now on the other side of this story, you've got Icebox. If you're not familiar, this isn't some random jewelry shop in a mall. This is one of the most recognizable names in the hip-hop jewelry scene. Located in Atlanta's upscale Buckhead area, Icebox built its reputation by catering directly to celebrities, rappers, athletes, influencers, people whose image sells. Because in this world, jewelry isn't just about diamonds and gold, it's about visibility. Who's wearing it, where they're wearing it, and most importantly, who's watching? So when someone like Young Thug walks into a place like Icebox, it's not a normal customer walking through the door. It's an opportunity. Every chain he wears, every bracelet, every watch, it's not just a product anymore. It becomes content. It becomes marketing. It becomes a signal to millions of fans that this is where the stars shop. And that kind of exposure, you can't just buy it with ads. So naturally, the relationship between artists and jewelers started evolving into something more than just buy and sell. It became strategic. Around May 2017, Young Thug starts doing business with Icebox. And from the outside, it probably looked like a typical celebrity shopping experience. Luxury pieces, custom designs, high price tags. But behind the scenes, the structure of these deals is very different from what most people are used to. Because instead of paying everything up front like a normal customer, artists are often given something much more flexible. They can take the jewelry first and settle the payment later. Now think about that for a second. If a regular person walked into a store and tried to leave with even a $5,000 watch without paying, it wouldn't even be a conversation. But here, we're talking about tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars, leaving the store on what is essentially trust. Or at least, that's how it looks. Over the course of multiple visits between 2017 and 2018, Young Thug selected several high-end pieces. We're talking about luxury watches, diamond bracelets, custom chains, the kind of items that don't just cost money, they represent status. Individually, each piece carried a serious price tag. Together, they added up to over $200,000. And he walked out with them. No full payment up front. Just the understanding that the money would be handled later. Now here's where most people stop and say, that's reckless. But if you look deeper, it's not that simple. Because from Icebox's perspective, this wasn't just about selling jewelry. This was about placement. Every time Young Thug wore one of their pieces in public, that was free promotion. When he posted photos wearing those chains, that was exposure to millions of followers. When he appeared in videos or events with those items, that was brand visibility money can't easily buy. So even without immediate payment, Icebox was still gaining value. And that's what makes this kind of arrangement so different from normal retail. It's not just a transaction, it's a trade. Visibility in exchange for access. Now, to be fair, this wasn't a one-sided situation. Young Thug didn't just disappear with the jewelry and ignore everything. Over time, he made payments, around $95,000 in total. That's a significant amount of money by any standard. But compared to the total value of what he took, it still left a large balance unpaid. And eventually, the payments stopped. Now, this is the moment where everything starts to shift. Because as long as the relationship is active, meaning the artist is wearing the jewelry, promoting it, and making payments, the situation feels like a partnership. But the second communication breaks down, it becomes something else entirely. A debt. From Icebox's point of view, they had provided over $200,000 worth of merchandise, and less than half of it had been paid back. From their perspective, this wasn't marketing anymore. This was money owed. So they did what any business would do when a large balance goes unpaid. They tried to collect. They reached out. They attempted to get a response. They gave time for the situation to be handled privately. But according to their claims, they got nothing back. No response, no agreement, no resolution. And when that happens in business, there's a next step. Legal action. But here's where things start to get complicated. And honestly, a little uncomfortable. Because when this situation moved from private communication to a public lawsuit, the narrative changed instantly. Now it wasn't just a quiet disagreement between a store and a client. It became a headline, a story, a public image issue. And in that moment, both sides had something to lose and something to gain. Because while Icebox was trying to recover money, the lawsuit itself created attention. And attention, as we already know, has value. At the same time, for Young Thug, this wasn't just about a bill anymore. It was about reputation. In the public eye, lawsuits like this can quickly turn into labels: irresponsible, unreliable, fraudulent. And those labels stick. So instead of quietly settling or ignoring it, he chose to respond. And that response didn't just deny the situation. It challenged the entire structure behind it. Because what his legal team argued next would take this from a simple unpaid balance to something much bigger. Something that goes beyond one wrapper and one jewelry store. Something that starts to question how this entire system really works. And once that argument hit the table, the story was no longer just about money. It became about the game itself. When the lawsuit hit, most people thought the story was already over. A jewelry store claims a rapper didn't pay his bill. End of discussion. But that's not what happened here. Because instead of staying quiet or settling immediately, Young Thug pushed back. And the way he responded is what changed everything. His legal team didn't just argue about numbers or deny the debt. They reframed the entire situation. According to their argument, this was never a simple customer transaction to begin with. It was something else. Something much more strategic. They claimed that Icebox didn't just allow him to take jewelry on credit. They actively encouraged it. Repeatedly. They allegedly reached out, offered pieces, and made it clear that payment didn't need to happen immediately. The message, according to Thug's side, was simple. Take the jewelry now. We'll figure out the rest later. Now pause for a second. Because if that's true, it changes the entire context. This isn't a case of someone walking into a store and asking for credit. This becomes a case of a business extending that credit on purpose, knowing exactly who they're dealing with and what comes with it. A high-profile artist, millions of followers, constant visibility, in other words, influence. And influence, in today's world, can be more valuable than money. So the question becomes, what was Icebox really getting out of this arrangement? Because while the numbers on paper showed a growing balance, something else was happening at the same time. Every appearance Young Thug made wearing their jewelry was putting their brand in front of millions of eyes. Every Instagram post, every video, every public outing, it all worked like advertising. But not the kind you skip, the kind people pay attention to. And here's the part that makes this even more interesting. Traditional advertising costs money up front. You pay for a commercial, a billboard, a campaign, and you hope it brings customers. But this was different. This was guaranteed exposure. Because when someone like Young Thug wears your product, people notice. Fans want the same look. Other artists start paying attention. Your brand becomes part of the culture. And that kind of positioning is hard to measure, but extremely powerful. So from that perspective, even if the money wasn't fully paid yet, Icebox was still gaining something valuable, which leads to the argument Young Thug's team was building. They essentially suggested that Icebox wasn't just selling jewelry. They were running a system where artists are given access to expensive pieces, encouraged to wear them publicly, and allowed to build up large balances over time. And then, when the situation reaches a certain point, everything changes. Because once the payments slow down or stop, the dynamic shifts instantly. What used to feel like a partnership suddenly becomes a legal obligation. Deadlines appear, pressure increases, and eventually, lawsuits enter the picture. Now here's where things start to get even more layered. Because the lawsuit itself doesn't just exist in a courtroom, it exists in the public eye. When Icebox filed that claim for hundreds of thousands of dollars, it didn't stay private. It became news. Blogs picked it up. Media outlets talked about it. Social media amplified it. And suddenly, the name Icebox was everywhere again. Now think about that. Even people who had never heard of the store before were now aware of it. And not just aware, they were associating it with high-value jewelry and big-name artists. That's powerful branding. And this is exactly why Young Thug's legal team took things a step further. They pointed out that even during this dispute, Icebox was still using his image in their promotional content. Photos, videos, posts, content that featured him wearing their jewelry. Which raises another question. If the relationship had broken down to the point of a lawsuit, why was his image still being used? Because at that point, it's no longer just about a financial disagreement. It becomes about control over identity, about who benefits from the association and who doesn't. And this is where the conversation moves beyond just one case, because what Young Thug's team was really doing was putting a spotlight on a pattern, a way of doing business that, according to them, had been happening for years. Not just with him, but with other artists too. And one name that often comes up in this conversation is Soulja Boy. Long before this situation, Soulja Boy had his own issues with Icebox. He was actually one of their earliest high-profile clients. At one point, he was publicly associated with the brand in a major way. But behind the scenes, a similar situation developed. Jewelry was taken, balances built up, payments slowed, and eventually, legal action followed. Years later, that situation still had financial consequences attached to it, which adds weight to the idea that this isn't just a one-time misunderstanding. It's a recurring pattern of high-risk, high-reward relationships. And here's the truth that makes all of this so complicated. Both sides can be right at the same time. From Icebox's perspective, they provided real products with real value. They had records, invoices, and proof of transactions. Money was owed. That part is straightforward. But from Young Thug's perspective, the situation wasn't presented as a strict, traditional purchase. It was framed as something flexible, something ongoing, something that came with mutual benefit. And when those expectations don't match, conflict is almost guaranteed. Because one side sees a business deal, the other sees a collaboration. One side expects payment on a timeline, the other expects understanding and flexibility. And when communication breaks down, those differences don't just stay in the background. They explode into the open. That's exactly what happened here. And once it reached that point, it was no longer just about recovering money or defending a reputation. It became about defining the relationship itself. Was this a sale? Or was it something closer to a marketing partnership? That question is at the center of everything. Because depending on how you answer it, the entire situation looks completely different. And that's why this case caught so much attention. Not just because of the money involved, but because it forced people to look at an industry practice that usually stays behind closed doors. The idea that luxury, influence, and business are all connected in ways that aren't always obvious. And the deeper you look into it, the more you realize this isn't just about jewelry. It's about leverage. It's about who really benefits from the relationship. And it's about understanding the rules of a game that most people don't even realize they're playing until it's too late. By the time everything reached its peak, this situation was no longer just about a bill, a store, or even a lawsuit. It had turned into something much bigger. Because now, people weren't just asking whether Young Thug owed money. They were asking how deals like this even happen in the first place. And more importantly, who really benefits when they go wrong. At this point, both sides had already made their positions clear. On one side, Icebox had the paperwork, the numbers, and the legal claim. From a business standpoint, their argument was simple. Jewelry was delivered, payments were incomplete, and the remaining balance needed to be paid. That's standard. But on the other side, Young Thug's argument had already shifted the conversation. Because instead of focusing only on the debt, he focused on the environment that created it. And once that perspective entered the discussion, everything started to look different. Because now, people weren't just looking at what happened. They were looking at why it happened. Why would a business allow such a large amount of merchandise to leave without full payment? Why extend that level of trust repeatedly? Why build a system where six-figure balances can exist in the first place? And the more you think about those questions, the more you realize something important. This wasn't random, it was intentional. Not necessarily in a malicious way, but definitely in a strategic one. Because in industries driven by image, perception is everything. And jewelry, especially in hip-hop culture, isn't just an accessory, it's a statement. It represents success, status, power. So when a major artist is seen wearing a certain brand, it sends a message. Not just to fans, but to other artists, to influencers, to anyone trying to reach that level. It creates demand. And demand drives business. Which means the real value of that jewelry isn't just in the materials, it's in who's wearing it. That's the hidden layer most people don't think about, because from the outside, it looks like the artist is benefiting the most. They get the chains, the watches, the image. But behind the scenes, the business is gaining something just as powerful. Visibility at a scale that traditional marketing can't easily replicate. And that's why these relationships exist. But they only work smoothly under one condition: alignment. The moment both sides are benefiting, everything feels natural. But the second that balance is disrupted, the entire structure starts to collapse. And that's exactly what happened here. At some point, the payment slowed. Communication broke down. Expectations no longer matched reality. And once that happened, the relationship couldn't stay in that gray area anymore. It had to become defined. Which is where the lawsuit came in. Because legally, things have to be clear. Either it's a debt, or it's something else. There's no in-between. And as the case moved forward, all of these questions, arguments, and narratives started building pressure on both sides. Public attention increased, speculation grew, and the longer it stayed unresolved, the more unpredictable it became. Then suddenly, it was over. In August 2019, the lawsuit was dismissed. No dramatic court decision, no detailed public explanation, just gone. Now, when something like that happens, it usually means one thing: a private resolution, some kind of agreement behind closed doors. Maybe money was paid, maybe terms were adjusted, maybe both sides decided it wasn't worth continuing publicly. But whatever the exact outcome was, it stayed between them. And in a way, that's fitting. Because this entire situation existed in a space that's not fully public to begin with. A space where business, influence, and image overlap. Where deals aren't always as straightforward as they appear. And where the real terms aren't always visible from the outside. But even though the case itself ended quietly, the conversation didn't. Because what Young Thug's response did was leave a mark. It introduced an idea into the public space that people couldn't ignore anymore. The idea that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about one unpaid bill. It was about a system. A way of doing business that depends on perception, leverage, and timing. A system where artists are given access to luxury without immediate cost. But that access comes with expectations. And if those expectations aren't met, the consequences can escalate quickly. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean every jeweler is operating with bad intentions, and it doesn't mean every artist is being taken advantage of. What it does mean is that these relationships are more complex than they seem. They're not simple transactions. They're calculated exchanges. Both sides are making moves based on what they believe they'll gain. And sometimes, those calculations don't line up. That's when situations like this happen. And when they do, they reveal something important: the gap between perception and reality. Because from the outside, it's easy to look at a celebrity wearing hundreds of thousands of dollars in jewelry and assume everything is owned, paid for, and secure. But behind that image, there can be agreements, obligations, and risks that aren't visible. And that's the part most people never see, until something goes wrong. And when it does, it changes how you look at everything. Now suddenly, the jewelry isn't just jewelry. It's part of a larger system. A system where image creates opportunity. Opportunity creates risk. And risk, if not managed carefully, can turn into conflict. That's the real takeaway from this situation. Not just who was right or wrong, but understanding how the game actually works. Because once you understand that, you start to see similar patterns everywhere, not just in jewelry, but in fashion, endorsements, branding, and influence as a whole. And you realize that a lot of what looks like success on the surface is actually built on agreements behind the scenes. Some clear, some complicated, and some only fully understood when they fall apart. In the end, the case between Young Thug and Icebox didn't give the public a clear winner. There was no final verdict that settled the debate. But maybe that's the point. Because the real value of this story isn't in the outcome, it's in the awareness it created, the questions it raised, and the perspective it offered into a world that most people only see from the outside. And once you've seen that perspective, it's hard to go back to looking at things the same way again. Now, I want to hear from you. After hearing this whole situation play out, who do you think was really in the right? Was it Young Thug for pushing back and calling out how these deals actually work behind the scenes? Or was it Icebox for simply trying to collect money on jewelry that was never fully paid for? Because depending on how you look at it, this story can go both ways. Drop your opinion in the comments right now. I'm reading everything, and I want to see where you stand on this. And if this video made you think a little differently about how the industry really operates behind the scenes, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Because there are a lot more stories just like this. Stories that look simple on the surface, but get way deeper once you break them down. Click on the next video on your screen, because trust me, if you thought this was crazy, the next one is going to open your eyes even more. Stay locked in.